The Mirror of Souls. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The wind howled through the desolate landscape, its cold fingers tugging at the corners of the crumbling mansion. The house stood like a forgotten relic, its once grand facade now marred by the relentless passage of time. No one dared venture near it, for the villagers spoke of a cursed history that stretched back centuries, whispered stories of unspeakable horrors that took place within its walls. Yet, there were always those curious enough to challenge the legends, to seek out the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of superstition. It was on a night much like this that a group of friends, Mark, Lily, Sarah, and Tom, decided to test the tales that had haunted their childhoods. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and their courage, they approached the mansion with tentative steps. They had heard rumors of an artifact within, an object said to have the power to reveal the deepest recesses of one's soul. It was called the Mirror of Souls, an ancient relic that was said to trap the very essence of those who gazed into it. The front door creaked open as Mark pushed it with a force that echoed through the silence. The air inside was thick with dust, the musty smell of decay overwhelming their senses. Their flashlight beams swept across the long-forgotten furnishings, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They took slow steps forward, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath their feet seemed to reverberate through the house, amplifying the sense of being watched. The group wandered through the mansion, following a narrow corridor that led them deeper into its bowels. It felt as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting with each passing moment. Every corner they turned seemed to stretch out before them longer than it should have. There was no sign of the mirror, yet the feeling of something malevolent growing closer seemed undeniable. They reached a small, dimly lit room at the end of the corridor, its walls lined with ancient portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow their every movement. In the center of the room stood a tall, ornate frame, draped in a heavy cloth. The air around it was thick with an unnatural chill, and the silence was deafening. Mark was the first to approach, his hand trembling as he grasped the fabric and pulled it away. There, in the center of the frame, was the Mirror of Souls. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary about it. It was a simple, albeit beautiful, mirror with a silver frame etched with intricate designs. But as they stared into its surface, the reflection began to shift, distorting into something unsettling. A twisted, hollow version of the room stared back at them. The light from their flashlight flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows across the walls. The mirror seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the air around it grew even colder. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom stepped forward, his eyes locked on the mirror. "It's just a reflection," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. But then something changed. The faces of the group began to distort in the reflection. They saw themselves, but not as they were. The mirror showed them as grotesque, twisted versions of themselves, their features warped with malice and despair. Mark's reflection grinned at him with a smile too wide, while Lily's eyes darkened, filled with terror that seemed to seep out of the glass. Sarah's face was consumed by shadows, and Tom's reflection stood motionless, a blank expression frozen in time. Panic set in. They tried to step away, but their bodies felt frozen, as if the mirror had them in its grip. The reflections began to move on their own, their twisted forms stepping out of the glass and into the room. They were no longer trapped in the mirror, they were alive, and they were coming for them. Mark screamed as his own reflection reached out toward him, its fingers like ice, its touch sending shock waves of terror through his body. Lily stumbled backward, but her reflection followed her every move, a mirror image of her every fear. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls narrowing, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The reflections laughed, their voices hollow, echoing with malice. They fought to escape, but every attempt was in vain. Tom grabbed the mirror frame, attempting to rip it from its place, but the moment his hands touched it, a surge of dark energy shot through his body. His reflection, now twisted beyond recognition, grinned at him in delight, its eyes full of a wicked satisfaction. Suddenly, the world around them seemed to shift. The room spun violently, the reflections multiplying, their twisted forms surrounding them on all sides. The group screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the void, drowned in the overwhelming darkness that seemed to pulse from the mirror itself. In the darkness, the mirror became a window to something far more sinister. The friends saw visions of their deepest fears, their darkest secrets, memories they had long buried resurfaced, distorted and twisted by the mirror's malevolent power. Mark saw himself lost, abandoned by everyone he loved. Lily saw a future filled with endless despair, a life consumed by loneliness. Sarah saw the people she cared about die in horrific ways, and Tom saw himself consumed by madness, his mind unraveling before his very eyes. The mirror didn't just show them who they were, it showed them who they could become, who they feared to be. It was not just a reflection of their appearance, but a glimpse into their very souls. But the worst part was yet to come. As the reflections continued to close in on them, the room began to distort further, and the friends realized that they were no longer in the mansion. They were trapped inside the mirror itself. The reflections began to laugh again, their voices merging into a single, haunting sound that reverberated through the very core of their beings. The friends were trapped in the mirror, their souls now part of the cursed artifact, doomed to remain within its cold, glassy prison forever. And the last thing they saw before they were consumed by the darkness was their own twisted reflections, smiling back at them with cruel delight. The mansion remained silent, the only sound the wind that howled through the broken windows. The mirror of souls sat alone in the abandoned room, its surface gleaming with the twisted souls of those who had dared to gaze into it. And somewhere, deep within its glass, the faintest echo of laughter could still be heard, growing louder with each passing moment. The wind howled outside, whipping through the desolate countryside like a forgotten wail of anguish. The mansion loomed in the distance, its once grand silhouette now a faded memory of elegance. Its windows were dark, the door sagging on rusted hinges, and the stone steps, now cracked and uneven, led up to the threshold of something far older than time itself. It was said to be cursed, its halls haunted by the spirits of those who had fallen victim to the mysterious artifact hidden within its decaying walls, the Mirror of Souls. The townspeople rarely spoke of the mansion, but when they did, it was in hushed tones, laden with fear. No one had dared to enter for decades, for it was known that those who entered never returned, or worse, they returned changed, their minds shattered, their eyes empty, their souls stolen. The legends surrounding the Mirror of Souls were enough to keep most at bay, but there were always a few brave or foolish souls willing to test the stories for themselves. On one storm-tossed evening, 4 such souls gathered in the town's only inn, their decision made despite the warnings of the innkeeper. Mark, the daring leader of the group, had always sought thrills where others saw danger. Lily, a skeptic at heart, sought to uncover the truth behind the myth. Sarah, ever the curious one, had an insatiable thirst for knowledge, and Tom, though quiet, had long been intrigued by the darker side of human nature. They had heard the legends, seen the fearful glances of those who refused to speak of the mansion, and yet, a part of them was drawn to it, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. "We'll prove them all wrong," Mark said, a confident grin on his face as they made their way toward the mansion that evening, their steps crunching in the frost-covered ground. "It's just an old house. No ghosts. No curses. Just a mirror." Lily shot him a skeptical glance. "You sound sure about that. What if there's more to it?" "Then we'll find out," Mark replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "If there's a curse, we'll break it. If there's a ghost, we'll see it. But I doubt it. We're just going to find an old mirror, maybe a few cobwebs, and that's it." They reached the gate of the mansion, its iron bars twisted and rusted, yet it creaked open with little resistance. The house seemed to breathe with the wind, and though the air was biting, there was a strange heaviness around them. The door to the mansion stood ajar, as though expecting their arrival. "Should we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. Tom nodded but said nothing, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the house, as though he could sense something unseen waiting for them. With a collective breath, they crossed the threshold, stepping into the musty darkness of the mansion's hallway. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the faint smell of mildew and decay filled their lungs. The walls, once adorned with grand tapestries, were now bare, save for the faded portraits of ancestors long forgotten. Their eyes seemed to follow the group, the faces twisted in silent judgment, as if warning them to turn back. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the house, each step carrying them further from the world they knew and into something far more ancient and dangerous. They didn't know what to expect. Perhaps the mirror would be a harmless curiosity, or perhaps it would be something far darker, a force that had waited centuries for someone foolish enough to stumble upon it. They passed through a grand hall, its walls lined with forgotten relics, and descended into the basement, where the cold was almost unbearable. In the center of the room, draped in an old cloth, stood an ornate frame. It was unmistakably the Mirror of Souls. It was beautiful at first glance, a tall, slender frame, etched with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change as they looked at them. The mirror itself gleamed in the dim light, its surface impossibly smooth, as though it had never been touched by time. There was a strange aura about it, something unsettling and ancient, yet undeniably captivating. Mark was the first to approach it, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had lured many before him. "So this is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Mirror of Souls. Is it safe?" Lily asked, her voice laced with caution. She stepped back, as though waiting for something to happen. "We'll find out," Mark said with a smirk, throwing back the cloth to reveal the mirror in its full, unsettling glory. The moment the cloth fell, a heavy silence descended upon them. The mirror seemed to draw in the light around it, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the surface of the glass began to ripple. At first, it was subtle, just a slight distortion of the reflections. But then, the images in the mirror started to change. Mark stared into the glass, his reflection beginning to shift. His face grew pale, his eyes widening with terror. His reflection grinned at him, a smile far too wide, a grin that stretched unnaturally across his face, showing teeth that were far too sharp. "Mark," Sarah whispered, stepping toward him, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Mark couldn't tear his gaze from the mirror. His reflection started to move independently of him, tilting its head in a mockery of his own actions. The glass began to warp further, and the rest of the group saw their own distorted faces reflected back at them. Lily's face was twisted in terror, her eyes hollow, drained of all warmth. Sarah saw herself, but not as she was. Her reflection was covered in shadow, her mouth a silent scream. Tom's reflection stood motionless, his eyes empty, devoid of thought. And then the mirror began to change again. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to stretch out impossibly. Shadows began to writhe, slithering along the walls as though they had a life of their own. The distorted versions of the group moved in the mirror, their forms now reaching out toward them, stretching, and growing taller as though trying to break free. Lily screamed as her reflection reached toward her. It was not just a reflection anymore, it was something alive, something that wanted to claim her. The others were caught in the same trap. Their reflections were no longer confined to the glass, they were stepping out, crossing the boundary between the real world and the mirror's twisted version of reality. Tom tried to step back, but the space behind him seemed to disappear. The walls closed in, the room becoming smaller and smaller as though the house itself was shifting. They could no longer escape. The distorted versions of themselves surrounded them, grinning with malicious glee. Their faces twisted with cruelty, eyes burning with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Mark was the first to be consumed. His reflection grinned at him, its mouth stretching wide as it lunged for him. The others watched in horror as he was pulled into the mirror, his body vanishing into the glass like a flame swallowed by darkness. Lily tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the mirror's growing laughter. Her reflection reached out, and she felt icy fingers curl around her arm. She struggled, but it was no use. She was being pulled toward the mirror, her body no longer her own. Tom and Sarah tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. The room was closing in on them, the walls now mere shadows, and the mirror was all that remained, a portal to something far darker than they could ever have imagined. And then, the last thing they saw was their own faces, twisted and grinning back at them from the mirror, laughing as they were consumed by the darkness. The mansion stood silent once again, the only sound the wind that howled through the shattered windows. The mirror of souls gleamed in the dark, its surface smooth and undisturbed. But deep within the glass, if one were to listen closely, they might hear the faintest echo of laughter, cold, hollow, and eternal. The souls of the curious, the brave, and the foolish had joined the countless others who had dared to look into the mirror, forever trapped in its glassy prison. The end.